Hello.
Welcome everybody to tonight's program. I am John Haber, and sitting next to me is
Chris French. I'm Director of Development. How are you doing tonight, John?
great. I have my coffee. I'm ready to go. No Kahlua in it this time, but maybe later tonight. So, uh, so we are starting here with our third part of our five-part series entitled "Modern Design and the Sexual Revolution." I mentioned earlier the best way to ask those questions is to use our Q&A box. And I'm not going to take a long time going through the rigmarole here because I know most of you already know how to do these things. But if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A box or raise your hand. I'm going to turn it over to Chris to introduce tonight's speakers.
Oh, well, I always have to go over some of our basics, which is we encourage everyone to use the chat window often and frequently because we like to hear where you're from. I see we already have a lot of people from all over the country, and we already have somebody in the Q&A. I want to note that we do have people from 33 states and 4 countries, including Switzerland this time, John. We managed to get all the way over there. So we have them signed up for tonight, and we have a really exciting lineup. I have my glass of water because there's no way I could do my cocktail, but we did send out a fun cocktail recipe from Kelvin, which is inspired by Paul Rudolph and Bush Hammered Concrete. So that's something new. So if you didn't get that email, you could just text me or email me and I will send that to you from Kelvin. So first I wanted to invite George Smart from US Modernist Radio. George, there you go. How are you?
Hi.
Go ahead and tell us what you got, George.
Well, it is certainly our pleasure from US Modernist Radio to sponsor tonight. I want to start off by raising a toast to the California Preservation Foundation and to Docomomo US. So please join me in a little sip. And if you want to indicate your participation, you can just type clink in the chat box. All right. For those of you that are unfamiliar with our program, US Modernist Radio is a podcast. It's on every podcast platform there is, just about. We have great guests talking about modernism. People such as Daniel Libeskind, Barbara Bester, Moshe Softy, Tom Kundig, Marlon Blackwell, Frank Harmon, Raymond and Dion Neutra. A lot of people that you know, including people on the panel. We've had Chris on the show. We've had Kelvin on the show. Liz has been on the show. And coming up this summer, Richard will also be on the show. So thank you all very much for this opportunity to bring this to you. And let's go back to Chris.
Thank you, George. Here I am again. I'm so glad that you could help us sponsor. And just with that in mind, we also appreciate all of your donations. Chris Rollins, it's not your turn yet. All right. Anyway, we appreciate all of your donations to the California Preservation Foundation. Because of your generosity, we're able to offer all of these programs for free. And we do have one special program that's at the end. It's a professional training program that is going to be $60 if you use the coupon code Mod Squad. And we hope you can join us. We have special guests Katie Horak, Flora Chow, and Gunny Harbo, who was actually responsible for the restoration of Crown Hall in Chicago. So that's a program you won't want to miss. That's going to be on April 1st. That's our one paid program. Otherwise, it's all free, and we have you to thank for that. So I wanted to welcome one of our partners, Liz. Liz, come on for Docomomo US. We have some stories to share. First of all, we have a story. You go ahead, Liz.
We do have a story. Thanks so much, Chris. It's really wonderful to be partnering with our friends at the California Preservation Foundation, including my friend Chris. So let me share my screen. So I'm Liz Wojtakis, the executive director from Docomomo US, and it's such a pleasure to be here tonight with all of you, with all of our esteemed panelists, and George from US Modernists. It's really just a great group of friends. And speaking of friends, it was God, Chris, how many years ago was it?
I think it was 2011.
2011. So Chris and I were at a preservation conference in Buffalo, and this man here, I don't know if anyone recognizes him, but it's James Howard Kunstler. And he was giving a presentation, and then he started going on and on about how well, we shouldn't preserve modernism. And it was so fun because afterwards there was a little meet and greet, and you can see there's Chris with James, and that little red square is a Docomomo button.
Yeah, we snuck up on him and put a modernist button on him, and even though he proclaims to hate modernism, it was a nerd prank. It was really fun.
It was really fun. So that was really a fun night. So just to talk a little bit about Docomomo, I'm sure most everyone is familiar with Docomomo, but we are an international organization. We have this phrase that we say: before there was Mad Men, Design Within Reach, or Dwell, there was Docomomo. We were started in 1988 in the Netherlands. We have chapters all over the world. It's super fun to go to a Docomomo International conference because you sit around in a big circle like it's the UN. And just amazing to see colleagues from all over the world who love and preserve modernism. So here in the United States, we have, and sometimes I will be honest, I forget how many chapters we have. I believe we have 18 chapters. We do have some chapters that are what we call friends organizations, or, friends with benefits, as some of my board members like to call them, but they really are the heart and soul of Docomomo. They're run by volunteers, and they really do all of the heavy lifting in terms of making people aware of buildings that are endangered and providing educational opportunities. So speaking of educational opportunities, last year we had to pause our national symposium that was taking place in Chicago because of the pandemic. We have relaunched our Chicago symposium. It is 100% virtual, but it's going to be a super fun event, 4 days of lectures, tours. We're going to throw in some other fun things that we haven't announced yet. But the best part is that to participate in the symposium, the basic price point is just $100. So for 4 days of events and tours, you get to connect with all of your colleagues and support the work of Docomomo. We're really excited about how a virtual symposium will just connect a lot more people. So please check in the chat probably after I finish talking for the link to register for the symposium. All right, so I'm almost done here, but I thought it was a great way to talk about the advocacy work that Docomomo does. Is we have had to advocate for a ton of Paul Rudolph buildings. And my friend Kelvin Dickinson is my partner in crime on advocating for Paul Rudolph. So we're gonna have a little poll. And John, whenever you're ready to launch that. So the question is, of the 4 buildings pictured, and I'm not going to tell you their names, although you can see one, which of these Paul Rudolph buildings still stand unaltered? And well, I won't tell you how many, but which of these buildings still stand unaltered? And John, I will just have you tell me when you feel like we have a good group of answers. Oh, there we are. None of the above. So let's see. Most people picked B. I think we have a smart crowd. All right. So let's see what the answer is. So, whoops. A was Paul Rudolph's Orange County Government Center in Goshen, New York. This building, unfortunately, has been altered. They put this super tacky addition on, and you can see that they were unhappy with all the roof systems that Paul had deployed on this building. So you can see that they erased some of the different levels, and they really stripped it back to its studs. It still stands, but it was a loss. Next up is Burroughs Welcome. I'm sorry, this feels like a Debbie Downer now that I do it, but it's important to talk about advocacy because we really do need to learn from these projects. The beautiful Burroughs Welcome, the site of many movies, and the creation of AZT, the drug that saved the lives of many people who were suffering from the AIDS pandemic. This also, I hate showing demo pictures, but in reality, that is gone now as well. Niagara Falls Public Library. This building actually does still stand, and you're also smart for remembering that although this building has not been torn down, it is endangered, but it was altered, and I don't remember the date. I think it was pretty early on, and they removed some of those, again, some of the roofing elements as people complained about water. People always complain about water. And our last example, so many of you got it right, Boston Government Services Center and the Hurley Building. This still stands. We are advocating for it now. There are plans to create an element, a vertical element that Paul was not able to execute. But it's really it's a big, massive complex, but there's some really beautiful subtleties to it. You can see some of the landscaping is just quite lovely. On the left-hand side, one of my favorite features is there appears to be a frog built in. And then this wonderful piece of sgraffito by Constantino Nivola that's inside the Hurley Building. We're really hoping to be able to save this entire complex, and it has yet to be destroyed. So that's it for me. Thanks everyone again for supporting Docomomo. We are a member-based organization, so please become a member, and I'm excited to hear from the rest of the speakers tonight.
Thank you so much, Liz. All right, so next we have Chris Rollins, who is the author of Fire Island Modernist and an expert on the architecture of Horace Gifford. Are you ready, Chris?
I am.
Okay, where are you calling in from? Why don't you tell us where you're at real quick?
Oh, I'm in New York City.
Oh, fun. I can't wait to get back up there again. Okay, take it away.
All righty. Share. All right. Are you screen shared?
Yep, you look good.
All right. So, well, good evening, and thank you, Chris, for your introduction, and to the California Preservation Foundation for hosting this event. I'm always flattered when an organization like the CPF invites me to speak, because I am basically a full-time architect, but only a dilettante historian. While we create buildings from wood and stone, architects are really students of human relationships. I've always had an interest in how buildings shape a society and how society in turn shapes them. Rather like Darwin exploring the Galapagos, an architect that ventures to an island tends to find very particular ecosystems. I soon chanced upon a trove of unsung mid-century architecture that was hiding in plain sight. For example, something kept drawing my eye through this particular tangle of holly trees. A meandering wooden bridge suspended high above a hillside threaded its way to a house seemingly floating among the treetops. Other odd and alluring homes invited exploration with the hook of a soaring roofline, or a breezeway cut right through the middle of a house, or a dance of platforms artfully dodging the trees. None looked alike, but all seemed to be part of an extended architectural family. I began knocking on doors and was regaled with alternately poetic and salacious tales of the young, handsome, and talented architect who once had the run of this island, an eccentric and charismatic man whose business attire consisted of an attaché case and a Speedo. I was exploring Fire Island Pines, one of 18 summer communities on a glorified sandbar which protects the south shore of Long Island from the Atlantic Ocean, forming the Great South Bay. 31 miles long and barely a quarter of a mile wide, Fire Island rewards the effort to reach it with car-free boardwalks and expanses of protected dunes. Between 1960 and 1980, Gifford led the transformation of Fire Island's terrain, but in rediscovering his architecture, I also found a portal to a lost culture, truncated by age and winnowed by the passage of time, but still resonant with artistic and cultural significance. I learned that Marilyn Monroe and Montgomery Clift once spurned Hollywood limos for the rustic charms of Fire Island's boardwalks. Truman Capote wrote Breakfast at Tiffany's here. Diane von Furstenberg showed off her latest wrapped dresses for an audience that included Halston, Giorgio Santangelo, Calvin Klein, and Jeffrey Bean. And composer Ned Rorem was inspired by the staccato rhythms of the new modern beach houses, quote, architected by Horace Gifford so that you live simultaneously indoors and out. Today, an equivalent roster of talent generally hides away in gated compounds, but these celebrities lived in modestly scaled homes alongside middle-class vacationers, all with equal access to Fire Island's natural beauty. This alchemy of egalitarianism and star power owed much to the Pines' proximity to the gay and bohemian enclave of Cherry Grove. Peggy Fears, a Cherry Grove transplant, former Ziegfeld Follies showgirl, Broadway producer, and glamorous lesbian, held court at her yacht club. Fears introduced the theatrical show business undercurrent to the Pines that persists to this day. Soon, the Homeowners Association tried to make the interlopers unwelcome, as it was well known that once gays discover a neighborhood, real estate values plummet. From the beginning, the majority of Horace Gifford's clients were gay men, and his architecture traced the arc of gay liberation with uncanny precision. From early 60s pavilions that provided refuge from a hostile world, to exuberant post-Stonewall, pre-AIDS masterpieces that orchestrated bacchanals of liberation. A true child of the 60s, Gifford landed his first Fire Island clients by sleeping with them. This architect with benefits arrangement resulted in a celebrated house, many referrals, and Gifford's first magazine cover. Another early home was conceived for Angelo Donghia, the soon-to-be famous interior designer who shared his home with a young fashion designer named Halston. Donghia's classicizing influence could be felt in the broad axial walkway that approached 3 arched bays, though Gifford prevailed in saving the trees. Paint and plaster make a rare appearance in this house, but aesthetics was not the only sensibility that separated architect and client. Donghia could be quite imperious. Gifford eventually fired his client and filed the drawings in a red scrawl under the heading of Miss Donghia. But most clients were charmed by the architect's plain-spoken manner and dry humor. Describing his concept for a home that was held aloft on slender, hollow towers that lifted it into the treetops, Gifford began his design presentation by declaring, quote, "You will now have 20 closets to come out of." Behind the humor lay thoughtful strategies for building in this unique environment. Prior to Gifford's arrival in the Pines, most of the homes were mean, prefabricated cottages with tiny windows, delivered on barges and dragged across the fragile dunes. They came to an ignoble rest upon a scrum of skinny pilings. Gifford rejected prefabrication so that materials could be carried by hand onto undisturbed sites. He composed and selectively clad the bases of his homes to be of a piece with the architecture. All surfaces were treated essentially like floors, with planks that flexed with the inevitable movements of a house on stilts. Now, modern architecture was not an obvious vehicle to house gay liberation. The older adjacent gay community of Cherry Grove was inhabited by theatrical characters and theatrical houses. Its signature architecture offered a delirium of urns, fountains, and painted curlicues that quickly flaked away in the sea air, like glue gun sequins on a homemade dress. This was architecture in drag. To a degree, the Pines' embrace of modernism, a popular aesthetic movement, can be seen as an act of assimilation compared to the outre fantasies of Cherry Grove. Horace Gifford's austere creations in cedar and glass housed a generation that traded muumuus for muscles and mascara for mustaches. His architecture was butch, yet many of the gay men who spent the 1970s clad in Levi's and flannel recognized the performative nature of this hyper-masculine drag. These dueling aesthetics come to a head every July 4th when a flotilla of Cherry Grove drag queens invades the Pines. Upon disembarking, they demand and receive free drinks all day. My favorite part of the invasion is the end of it, as melted drag queens stumble home in broken heels. So as you've probably gathered, Fire Island contains a lively bunch, and the houses that they build are tailor-made for drama. Perusing Gifford's blueprints and interviewing his clients, I came across spaces with names like the divorce room, which sulks under a veil of shadow. I'm quite fond of the makeout loft, a high perch for base desires. It was draped in sheepskin with reclined edges for bodies in repose. House Beautiful approached the makeout loft delicately. A fur-lined loft, they asked readers? Sure, for this is a homeowner who's enormously gregarious. Meanwhile, the true nature of the space was celebrated in Peter Jerome's art house porn films. The makeout loft surveyed the ocean and the psychedelic swirl of the conversation pit below. Sunlight passed through circular skylights onto a curved wall, creating a trippy light show of ovoid shapes. Gifford sheathed what was once a boxy 1950s cottage in a dynamic diagonal wrap that gyrated towards the meat rack, a notorious cruising area. The open heart of the Evans de Pass house was reserved for dancing, while decks facing due south, east, and west chased the sun. From a seated position, its solid deck rail created a filtered, idealized horizon line where ocean met sky. With its thrusting cantilevers and pulsating roofline, Gifford conjured a discotheque upon the dunes at the Lipkins house. Floor-to-ceiling glass extended across the entire coastal elevation. The clients, who owned a lighting company, tricked it out with multicolored runway lights. Its one secluded space was a subterranean lair dubbed The Cave, a windowless den of electric blue, shag-carpeted walls and oversized pillows. Most post-war houses shed their front porches and shielded nuclear families and backyard barbecue pits. Gifford countered with glass walls that opened to the nearby pedestrian boardwalks, fashioning voyeuristic vistas from within and without. After all, the Pines was a place to meet like-minded people, a place to marvel, as Albert Goldman put it, at, quote, the remarkable shorting out of the barriers to interpersonal communication. Cruising along at sunset with a glass in one hand and a modest pitcher of martinis in the other, you find yourself far more socially desirable than you ever realized. By the mid-70s, whimsical fantasies and cedar and glass traversed the entire beachfront of the Pines, best captured on the cover of the Pines phone directory. More than a mere listing, this was the little black book of social life in the Pines. Residents could be looked up by first name, last name, or house address, easing the anxiety of following up on introductions made in a haze of marijuana and cocktails. For this brave new world, Gifford invented an architecture of seduction. with voyeuristic expanses of glass, outdoor showers, mirrored ceilings, prurient lines of sight, and sexy conversation pits. Horace Gifford conferred a benevolent architectural order upon a culture in which all the old constraints were falling away. Yet Gifford retained a vestige of formality. In 1973, the architect hosted an elegant black tie party, but that's all they wore, black ties. But we should not confuse the flamboyance of Gifford's architecture with frivolity. Growing up on the beaches of Florida, he forged a deep connection with fragile coastal landscapes and became enamored with lyrical Sarasota beach houses designed by the young Paul Rudolph. In his Fire Island summer houses, Gifford would effect a plausible transplantation of many of the ideas that informed Sarasota's winter homes. He paired his Florida insights with ideas learned at the feet of Louis Kahn, his professor at the University of Pennsylvania. In Kahn's work, the 20th century obsession with glass and steel receded in favor of masonry structures that evoked ancient ruins. Kahn and Rudolph became the most important American architects of the 1960s, and Gifford styled himself as their architectural love child. In a short but prolific career that produced 78 modernist homes, he honed a sustainable architecture as attuned to natural landscapes as our animal natures. As one client put it, quote, everything is free and natural. His houses were intentionally small, tucked into undisturbed sites, and touched lightly upon the earth. Believing that life at the beach should be carefree as well as maintenance-free, he loathed painted surfaces, clipped lawns, and all the brute force associated with tending a typical suburban home. Reflecting both a communitarian and a voyeuristic ethos, he resisted fences. Bedrooms remained small to focus activity within commanding public spaces. Dancing across the sand like divinely inspired driftwood, these houses expressed the fluidity of the Cultural Revolution that they housed. Calvin Klein recalled that his Horace Gifford home was, quote, the ultimate hedonist house. I mean, it was made for sex. In Gifford's work, Stonewall-era sexuality merged with timeless environmental responsibility. Bathrooms that traded mirrors for plate glass may have facilitated dalliances on occasion, but they also drew the inhabitant's gaze away from himself towards an increasingly threatened nature. Living in Gifford's own home, as I did, invites certain psychological assumptions about the man who invented it. A light-flooded interior, a thoughtfully conceived plan, a symbiotic connection to all around it, everything in its place. But the resemblance of the man to his architecture was illusory. In truth, Gifford was haunted by specters both personal and political. Arrested for the crime of being gay, then celebrated in the press but sidelined by manic depression, and ultimately struck down by AIDS, his life followed the arc of repression, liberation, and despair that befell a lost generation. His work reminds us of the power of architecture to shape a culture, as well as its powerlessness to prevent its destruction. Through it all, he invented optimistic, forward-looking dwellings that, quote, reach out and grab for light. Horace Gifford died in 1992 at the age of 59. The 1-2 punch of AIDS, which also took much of his audience, and postmodernism, which rejected his ideas, obscured his legacy. Revisiting his work, it is fitting to understand these homes as revealing artifacts of their time and place, but they also speak to the perennial notion that crafting a more direct relationship to the natural world will lead to a restorative existence. The fact that this notion and this architecture is often sustained by the artificial and acquisitive life of the city remains one of its many paradoxes. But the longing for Eden persists, and his work bears the mark of a restless search for that illusory place. So perhaps the architecture reveals the man after all. Gifford liked to say that, quote, someday we will learn to live with nature instead of living on nature. In their sustainability and their seductive delight, the beach houses of Horace Gifford ennoble that wish and speak to us today with renewed power and purpose. And we cannot bring back Gifford or the lost generation that he represents, but we can preserve their most salient artifacts and the landscape in which they flourished. After the publication of Fire Island Modernist, I continued my exploration with the creation of Pines Modern, a nonprofit educational archive. To date, we have extensively documented over 60 modernist homes, often with newly commissioned professional photography. Pines Modern's website is optimized for self-guided tours. While Horace Gifford was the architectural ringleader of the Pines, we also include his illustrious colleagues. Like Arthur Erickson, Canada's most famous architect, who entertained fashion and disco royalty at a home that he built for himself in the Pines. At his housewarming, Erickson filled the double-height space with hundreds of silver and gold balloons. As Roberta Flack sang for the assembled guests, he pressed a button and the ceiling retracted, releasing the balloons into a starlit sky. And Harry Bates, the only surviving mid-century architect that practiced in the Pines. At age 93, he is now one of the most celebrated architects of the Hamptons with his firm Bates plus Massey. Or Andrew Geller, who began literally turning Fire Island's architecture on its head with quirky and endearing designs that revealed, quote, how far a little plywood and a lot of guts will take you. Along with our website, we lead guided house tours and maintain a physical archive that is made available to anyone who requests it. With historical knowledge, homeowners are renovating their homes with more care. And sometimes they hire me to help, like this residence by Horace Gifford, restored by Rollins Design for the original clients. Or this home, originally designed by an associate of IMK. And a restored Harry Bates home that we will photograph this spring. I was pleased that Docomomo chose to recognize our work with a Modernism in America award last fall. And in just a moment, after you get a quick second to read over my social media connections, websites, all that, I will surrender the mic to the moderators.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank
We're
you.
actually going to have Chris back for questions towards the end of the program when we can ask everyone have a chance to ask any of these things. But definitely put your questions in the Q&A, as John is always recommending. And then you can actually upvote questions that you like. And we'll be sure to ask those at the end. So thank you so much, Chris. We'll see you in a little bit at the Q&A.
Okay, great, thank you.
So now John and I would like to introduce a video, but he's sharing his whole screen. Anyway, we would like to introduce a video next. I had a great opportunity to interview Richard Williams. He's a professor of contemporary visual cultures at the University of Edinburgh, and he is the author of Sex and Modernism, which is one of the books that inspired this whole topic, or Sex and Buildings. And he's also finishing a book on intellectual biography of the architectural critic and provocateur Reyner Banham. So Richard is actually in the UK, where it's 4 hours ahead of even where I'm at on the East Coast. So what we've done is record this video for you, and then he might just jump in for the Q&A if he's away. But you can take it away, John.
Right. Well, thank you. It's lovely to be here. So just something briefly about me. I'm Richard Williams, as you can see. I'm a professor of contemporary visual cultures at the University of Edinburgh, where I've been teaching for a long time, since 2000. And I'm based in the School of Art History, so I'm really an art historian, although I deal with a very wide range of stuff. And the research that I've done, mainly the teaching that I do, tends to be about architecture. It tends to be about the reception of architecture, architectural modernism, in particular. And the topic of the talk today, this book, Sex and Buildings, is a book which I published in 2013. I'm the author of, I think, I've lost count, maybe it's 7, 8 books now, including the upcoming book on the critic Rayner Banham, which will be out in May. So what I'm going to do here is talk a little bit about this book, Sex and Buildings, which, as I say, is a book from a little while ago. And it came out of I think, a particular moment in time. It was a moment when I think I was thinking about the topic. I mean, we're all, who isn't interested in sex, right? But I was certainly thinking about the topic in various ways, and trying to think about how you would relate that very human topic to architecture. And I had a very simple question, a kind of dumb question, which was, where was sex? Where was sexuality in the conversation around modern architecture? So it's really a very simple premise. How do you talk about sex in relation to architecture? Where was that conversation? I was very curious to find out. So it's a book that goes on a slightly wild tour through various forms of theory and architecture. I mean, sadly, nothing, if you've read the conclusion to it, nothing happens to me at all remotely interesting. But it's an interesting tour anyway. And this is the contents page, just to give you a clue of what's in there. And partly to remind me what I actually wrote. So the beginning of it dealt with a kind of discourse around sex, where it's very much related to health, and there was a whole lot of stuff there about the architecture of Richard Neutra, who many of you will know about. The second chapter, which I'll illustrate shortly with an interesting picture, but it was about Wilhelm Reich's theories of orgone energy, and well, I mean, that really was very interesting to explore. There was a chapter about communes and communal living, where I went or tried to revisit one of the most fascinating communes of late 60s America, which was Drop City in Colorado. There was a chapter on skyscrapers and phallic architecture in general. Pornomodernism is the thing which it's a term which I came up with, which I'll say a little bit more about later. There was a chapter on hotels. There was a chapter on how you would envisage a feminist city, and in fact, there's a very interesting new book on that topic out, which has revisited a lot of the things which I was interested in there, and queer spaces as well was a major concern. So some of the key images in the book, and I was really preoccupied with images here and representations of buildings as much as buildings themselves. But some of the key images, key buildings were included this. This was Rudolf Schindler's Kings Road house in Hollywood, built in 1922. Very much discussed in histories of American modernism, and it interested me partly because Schindler was such a sort of raffish character, but partly because of the design of the house. It was a house built for 2 young couples, and it had these unusual sleeping arrangements with 2 kind of exterior sleeping canopies, and the idea was it would be almost like camping. And in the subtext to this house, there seemed to be a kind of primitive idea of sexual liberation there, that these two couples would be really quite intimate with each other. So I explored that a little bit. That was an important image. There is Schindler himself on the right-hand side, this rather sort of piratical figure standing there, really interesting character. I was very interested in the case study houses, built many of them in California, and this was a series of houses that were commissioned, not all of them built, but commissioned as ideas from 1945 by the visionary editor of Arts and Architecture, the American Architecture Journal. And a number of these seem to be very interesting to me in this context of thinking about sexuality and architecture, not because of their intentions, because I think many of these houses were built as straightforward explorations of new technology. How could you build cheaply, quickly, using materials that were readily available? How would you house the families that were going to be produced just after the Second World War? Very, very practical questions. But there was something in the way that these buildings were imaged, particularly in the work of photographers like Julius Schulman, which seemed to raise questions about their sexual life, or their potential sexual life. So this was one image which I said something about, and total speculation, but a picture by Julius Schulman of case study house number 21, the Bailey House, where there seemed to be in Schulman's picture some kind of sexual tension there in this image. And it was very striking that the notoriously sex-obsessed publisher Taschen, when they published a book about this house, that this was the image they put on the cover. There's there's something going on in this image, which was certainly open to the idea of a sexual or libidinal interpretation. So I made some speculations about that, which you're welcome to shoot down. But it seemed that there was something going on in these images by Schulman. I mean, even in something like this, case study house 22, also by Koenig, the architect. And it was, I suppose, what was interesting for me about Schulman's images was that he populated his houses. He populated them with young, attractive people. Sometimes, as you saw in the previous image, there was some sort of sexual tension that seemed to be there. But there was certainly a sense that these buildings were inhabited. And if you know about the history of architectural photography, and the way that buildings have been represented in the architectural journals, then very often they're depopulated. Architectural photographers often hate the buildings to be populated by anybody. They want them to be empty, like sculptures. So those images were interesting. And then, well, actually, much later on, this is a picture which didn't appear in the book, but I did start to, for another project, did start to look at how this particular case study house had been photographed later on, and you end up with an extraordinary range of advertising and TV productions and strange things like this. Stephen Meisel's extraordinary fashion shoot for Valentino from 2001, one of a whole series of pictures of just abject debauchery going on in this house. And I was very pleased to see this because it seemed to confirm my thesis, as it were, that there was a kind of erotic undercurrent to these houses, that the way that they were talked about, gossiped about, perhaps. Quite often, I ended up having to look at things on the edge of architecture, so representations that were not necessarily produced by architects. So this was quite an important image in the chapter on skyscrapers. Madelon Friesendorf, an image called Flagrant Délit from '76, and it depicts the Chrysler Building and the Empire State in bed together, having clearly just had sex, and there's this deflated airship or blimp, the Goodyear blimp, as a sort of surrogate condom there on the bed. I mean, a ridiculous image, but a kind of an interesting one as well. So quite often we were looking at representations of things as much as the things themselves. And this was important too. Mad Men, now receding into memory, but this important TV series from 2007 onwards, and the set design for this was, if you remember it, remarkable in its attention to detail. It's brilliant modernist interiors, very elusive to mainstream modernist office design. It did those things really well, and then it populated them with these extraordinary characters where there was any amount of sexual tension, sort of sexual transgressions, sometimes very disturbing transgressions. There was a rape scene early on. It could be really unsettling and disturbing. And the sexual politics of the office is played out in a brilliant way in this series. And there's an episode from early on. Episode 8, the first season, with these two in a sexual clinch early one morning. So representations are important. I said I'd show you a picture of the orgone accumulator, and there's me, much younger and thinner, enjoying the cosmic energy of the orgone box at the Reich Museum. And this seemed to me is one of the points where there's a concern for architecture and some kind of energy, whether it was sexual energy or not, I don't know. And I have to say, the box did absolutely nothing for me. So, anyway, on to this idea. I think this, in some ways, was one of the richest parts of the book. This concept, pornotopia, or sorry, pornomodernism is really my term. Actually, I should say pornotopia is my mistake here. It's a book by Beatriz Colomina, Beatriz Preciado, one of Colomina's students. An extraordinary book, which also looked at the Playboy house. As I did, we were sort of looking at it at much the same time. So my term was pornomodernism, which I haven't used a great deal since then, but there's a number of things in it which I think are worth exploring. So this was one place in the discourse around modern buildings where there seemed to be some sort of explicit connection between sex and architecture. And it's curious, it should be Playboy. It was quite sort of uncomfortable discovering that in a way, because of Hefner's a strange and difficult and not altogether pleasant character, and the organization turned out to be incredibly secretive and uncooperative, difficult to deal with. So in fact, I couldn't reproduce any of these images in the book. But I looked at the Playboy townhouse. This was an unbuilt project from 1962. Playboy had some ideas about what would constitute good building, and it's a 4-story house built or proposed for the Gold Coast in Chicago. It's got 5 bathrooms, no less than 5 bathrooms. It's really just built for one man. It's got a pool with glass walls, and there's a voyeuristic and exhibitionistic character to the whole house. You can, as you'll see in that image there, it's a house built around the pool, and you can see the pool from all directions. And it has this is the first image of the notorious bed, which was clearly built as you know. This is a kind of prototype bed which was, as it turned out to be in real life, circular, motorized, sorted out with all the latest communications. So basically you could spend your entire life from the bed. The bed, as I say here, was designed as the center of operations. And all of these things were supposed to be built in this Playboy club, which in the end wasn't built, but some of those elements did turn up in the Playboy mansions. And there is the bed from the Chicago Club from 1966, and Hefner, as you know, spent his life there. It was a workspace and a space of all kinds of entertainment. And I've actually quoted Preciado there. But Preciado is now not called Beatriz, but called Paul. So she's transitioned to Paul in the time that I've been following her writing. And in fact, he says here, he makes a very nice comparison between the Playboy bed and the bizarre situation that we've all found ourselves in the last 12 months with the coronavirus pandemic. We've all ended up in a situation rather like this, where life and work have all congealed in the same place. Anyway, enough of that. But Preciado is a really important writer here. So in terms of my term, porno modernism, having set it up in relation to the Playboy's ideas about architecture, then I went on to look at a couple of buildings by John Lautner. And Lautner, who was a native of Michigan, ended up in Los Angeles, where he was an architect who, for various reasons which I don't entirely understand, seemed to have fallen out with most architectural journalists. But one place that his work was routinely published was Playboy, and there's a few articles describing his buildings. And although he was, I think, completely embarrassed by, or not embarrassed, I think infuriated by the fact that his only coverage was there. Nevertheless, what Playboy says about these buildings is quite interesting, and it finds in Lautner's houses some of the qualities that it was promoting in that idea of the townhouse. So it found buildings that, although they were designed for family life by the architect, it found buildings that seemed to be hedonistic. They were organized around the display of the body. The pool was always very important. There were often places where you could watch people unobserved, so there were voyeuristic qualities about them. And those qualities seem to be recognized in all sorts of cultural forms. So there's the extraordinary Elrod House in Palm Springs, which I visited on an unbelievably hot day in about 2011. And it has this sort of circular plan with a gigantic concrete ceiling. And it has, like all Lautner's houses, it really pays a lot of attention to the bedroom, and that is the main bedroom in the house. And Playboy covered this when it had just been built, and it said all sorts of things that were designed to appeal to Playboy readers, and clearly it set up the house as a place for sexual adventures, as it were. And that idea got very mainstream coverage in this film, where there's this slightly weird, rather sadomasochistic scene where James Bond gets beaten up by these two women in the film Diamonds Are Forever from 1971, and there's quite a protracted scene, a rather unpleasant scene actually, in that film. Then there's this house, not long ago donated to LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, by Goldstein, who's the current or was the current owner of the house. rather extraordinary character. And it's a house built in 1963, again covered by Playboy, again built with the most straightforward family-oriented concerns. It's a big concrete triangle built around a pool. It has all sorts of places in the house where you can watch people unobserved. And it has had quite an existence in film. There have been various porn films that have been made there. There's an artistic installation by an Austrian artist called Dorit Margreiter, which was set there for the same reasons. And it shows up in the Big Lebowski. As you remember, there's this film by the Coen brothers from 1998. But just to go back to a couple of those images, this is one of the key places in the house that is, there is something very explicitly voyeuristic going on. So from the master bedroom, you can look directly into the pool. The bedroom is gigantic, or the main bedrooms are gigantic. There are all sorts of games going on with exhibitionism and voyeurism there in the design of the house. It has this extraordinary bathroom on the ground floor where every surface is mirrored, most disconcerting thing. So there's all kinds of stuff going on there. And like I say, it very often shows up in popular culture as a house with sexual potential. So that chapter, Pornomodernism, was an exploration of these things. And I think one of the key things I'd say about it is that these fantasies about this peculiar sort of Californian modernism, these fantasies often exceed anything that the architects were really saying outright. So it was important for me to explore the way that these buildings were represented in culture. So on to just briefly something about this more recent project, because I think Reyner Banham, although he's somebody who never wrote explicitly about sexuality and buildings, he's certainly interested in these questions of fantasy. And he's somebody who's one of the great apologists for Los Angeles as a city, and a lot of his interest in that is as a city with uniquely hedonistic possibilities. So just a couple of things. He loves cars, but from often a sort of fantasy perspective. So here in 1955, he writes about this car, the Cadillac 60 Special. Which is an extraordinarily sexual looking car in terms of its design. And he says something explicitly about that. And at this point he can't drive. So his fantasy is not just about the form of the car, but it's about the fantasy of driving altogether. Los Angeles, The Architecture of Four Ecologies is a book which explores the whole city as a set of fantasies, and so a large chunk of the book is about the life of the beach, and there's all kinds of things going on there which we can relate back to that the earlier project, Sex and Buildings. There he is in the film that was made of the book in 1972. Reyner Banham loves Los Angeles. There's a huge amount of fantasy going on here. Fantasies are not just of about the libidinal nature of the city, but fantasies to do with putting himself in a new environment, imagining himself in somewhere sort of hedonistic and different from the England where he grew up. There he is in the Mojave Desert as late in life as a sort of cowboy, but riding a molten bike. So these things, anyway, you can explore a bit later on in this book, Reyner Banham Revisited, which will appear in May. So that is pretty much all I've got to say. But I think that it was a fascinating project to try and explore, to try and make these connections between sex and buildings. It was very difficult sometimes. Sometimes you were looking for something that was perhaps not there in the official discourse around buildings, but it was there in the discourse, the more popular discourses around buildings, in the fantasies that people have projected onto them. And it's a project which you can absolutely continue, and I would expect to be continued and challenged and turned into something else as time goes on. But I'll stop there.
All right. I hope everybody enjoyed that. I have a funny story about that book that Richard wrote. I actually have bought 3 copies of his book because I kept loaning them out and I never got the copies back. So anyway, he's a great person who's been studying that topic for a long time. I wanted to make sure that everybody knows in the Q&A, there's a lot of questions and answers going on there. Chris Rollins is in the Q&A box answering a lot of questions if you have any for him. And I wanted to welcome our last speaker of tonight. I hope everybody's having fun with their happy hour and drinking your drinks. And here's the author of our concrete and coffee drink, Kelvin Dickinson. You can go ahead and start your video. He's president of the Paul Rudolph Heritage Foundation. And I think he's going to update us.
Where? Let's see. I can't start.
He's lost somewhere in our Zoom land. But he's going to update us on what's happening to Paul Rudolph. And while Kelvin is getting himself going. There you are.
Yay.
Hi.
Have a drink, everybody.
Hey, Kelvin.
Hi.
Go ahead, take it away.
Great. Thank you. So I am new to this whole Zoom thing, so I'm going to take a second here to get my share screen. Okay. Okay, so my talk is Paul Rudolph and the Search for Sensuous Space. And, you know, it's kind of hard to talk about, it's not really that hard to talk about Rudolph and the idea of sensuous space, because he started off in such a interesting manner of somebody who became a person who did his work. Oops, let's see. He was pretty much known as being a straight-laced guy in Florida and grew up the son of a minister. And therefore, it was interesting because he kind of took that along with a little bit of a inspiration from Frank Lloyd Wright and became one of the most famous architects in the world by the time it was the 50s. And so we've got a picture over here of Rudolph in front of his famous Yale Art and Architecture building. This is him in front of the building that made him pretty much world famous. And this is what everyone thinks of when they think of him as a brutalist. But in reality, Rudolph started out early on. He was born in 1918, was influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright, and actually started most of his work in Florida. And in Florida, his work is primarily known for their extremely interesting and buildings that become very diagrammatic, very much about structure, about forced perspective, and about repetition and open plan. And so his renderings were what made him very famous. And so, for instance, we have here his work at, okay, we're going the wrong way, actually in Florida. So the drawings that made him famous are in the middle of the slide there. And then the Burkhardt residence is kind of an example of a built example of one of his projects. And he was really about forms that were made from wood and also made on a, they were made basically to fit in the environment. There was no air conditioning. There was a repetition of form. They were built on simple structural elements that could be trucked out to the site. And that actually is what made him world famous, was the idea that he could render these objects in space. Sarasota became the thing that made him famous. And that kind of launched his career. And he didn't become a brutalist until much later. And I'm trying to get my slide to move forward. Okay. Sorry about this. I'm trying to figure out why I'm not able to move forward. I've got lots of interesting slides to show you about his work later. That's what I'm trying to figure out, why this is not working.
Kelvin, just try clicking on your screen.
That's what I'm trying to do. I know I have too many windows open. I have a new computer, and new computers aren't always the best thing.
I have a copy on hand if you'd like me to pull them up, Kelvin.
That's probably a good idea, because for some reason I had this working and now it's not.
All right, 1 second here.
Isn't somebody always got to be this way in a Zoom call? I have to be that guy today. I'm not the one.
You're good, Kelvin. That's why we have John here. He's all our backup.
Exactly. Can you phone yourself? I need you in New York, please.
Is this the slide we were on? I'm sorry, I missed
Next
it.
one, yeah. The Finney Guest House, but let's move on to the next one, yeah. Okay, so I want to start actually talking about Rudolph, because Rudolph really began experimenting with architecture, I think, when he freed himself up from what he was doing in Florida. Air conditioning, the idea of enclosing the house so that he didn't have to deal with sunlight and ventilation and all the breezes and all the requirements of not having an air-conditioned space, is what actually allowed him to be a little bit more free with the floor plan, and therefore a little bit more free with the idea of space. So for instance, Rudolph thought that functionalism was not, at this point, the sole determinant of a house. He kind of broke away from the Sarasota School of Architecture in that sense, and he believed that architecture should be more about manipulated space. And so I wanted to kind of bring this house up first, because the Milam residence, which is air conditioned, it's in Ponte Vedra Beach in Florida, 1958 is his first house where he actually gets to play with space without having to worry about breezes and light and the idea of getting a breeze to get the space cool. So the front facade, now this is interesting because Rudolph actually begins working, in this case, most of his houses prior to this are front and back similar because he's got to get the breeze through. But in this case, because the space is air conditioned, he can actually say that the front of the house, which is the house up on the upper right-hand side, that's the front of the house. That becomes more of a private and not a very open to the public front facade of the house. And he saves all the fun of the house towards the back. And that is what you see on the lower right. And so Rudolph really starts to discover that it's all about, business in the front, party in the back, and he begins to split the house down the middle. And the idea is that you have a front facade, which is meant for the public, very private, and then you have this back facade, which is very open. In this case, it was right on the beach so that he was able to show off the whole beach to the people inside the house. Now, what's interesting about the house floor plan is that he begins to manipulate space. So he begins to work with floor plan, both in section and in floor plan, so that the floor plan is a series of platforms. The floors drop to create conversation pits in the living area. And then you go up a couple of steps to get to the dining area. And then you go up another 4 steps, which becomes an inglenook. Now the inglenook offers what Rudolph calls a nest. And actually it was interesting when the house was first published that they actually talk about these spaces as if they had certain feelings, which is what Rudolph encouraged. So Rudolph said in Architectural Record in 1961, for instance, that one could locate himself according to his mood in the space. So the inglenook offers a rest, and you can see the inglenook, very Frank Lloyd Wright inspired, in the middle of the upper part of the slide. That is actually surrounded by a fireplace. He was very much influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright, and that is the inglenook. And then the idea beyond that is the 2-story portion of the living room and the dining room space, which provides what Rudolph was famously calling a goldfish bowl. And on the rendering you see on the left-hand side becomes this conversation pit goldfish bowl, which is opening to the beach onto your left. And then finally, underneath that is the dining area, which is to the right of the goldfish bowl, which becomes what Rudolph calls the cave. And this is, the furniture is in this case meant to be built in, also very Frank Lloyd Wright inspired. And the idea is that the space can be meant for 6 people or 36 people, depending on the number of seats you provide or the number of cushions you provide on the floor. And so this is an example of where Rudolph begins to play with this idea of psychologically thinking about how space should be used. And so we can go to the next slide. Now, this is Rudolph's own house. This is at 31 High Street in New Haven, Connecticut. This is when Rudolph was chairman of the Art and Architecture program at Yale. And this is where he actually lived in 1961, 1962. He left Yale in 1965. He bought this building. It was a building that was already there. It was an Italianate building just down the street from the Yale building. And the building was this kind of very proper traditional building front facade. But typical Rudolph, what he does is he builds this party in the back. So what we have on the lower bottom right of the slide is a model that we've commissioned at the Paul Rudolph Heritage Foundation of what Rudolph built as an addition. And now this space is relatively celebrated. We've got the floor plans. The lower left is the ground floor, and then it goes up to the floor above on the next to it. And then we've got a section. Each of these were interesting in the sense that we've got the goldfish bowl on the left, which shows the kind of like a sunken conversation pit, which you see there in black and white. And then as you go up these stairs, which actually have no handrails, it's interesting, they're kind of these floating platforms that just kind of ascend in space. And then you get to this nest, which wraps around the fireplace, as we show on the photograph next to it. So you get this kind of like sense of space where you get this nest where you can kind of look down during parties into the floor below you. And actually, this was very popular during parties at Yale, where people would show up. And there's lots of stories about people who would say, they would see somebody walking down the steps to see if they would trip and fall down in front of everybody. And, there's lots of stories that Yale people like to tell about the parties that would go on here. But this house became pretty much famous while Rudolph was there for this reason. It became a very popular party space while Rudolph was at Yale. Next slide. Now, the first project that brought Rudolph to New York City was the Hirsch residence. This is at 101 East 63rd. I know a lot of you think of this as the Halston residence. I'm getting there. But originally it was built as the Hirsch residence. And the Hirsch residence was rather fascinating because, as you can see on the upper right, Rudolph was given a chance to tear down what was an original nondescript carriage building and turn it into this interesting building for 2 men who lived together who wanted to escape from the world around them. And so Rudolph creates this fascinating facade of mirrored glass. Everything is steel, and whether you've got shadow and everything becomes kind of like this interesting idea of what is transparent, what is translucent. Rudolph creates this very modern facade, glass and steel, which kind of gives you this front characteristic of leave me alone. And then what Rudolph does is because it's a row house in New York City and you don't get the chance of having a view in the backyard, Rudolph creates, and you can see this in the section on the upper top, this internalized space, which basically is totally internalized, multiple 3 stories tall, living room where people can celebrate and be themselves and not be around the prying eyes of their neighbors. Now, in 1966, this is considered extremely new because you're in New York City and you've got this kind of private space and you've got this front facade where people are kind of turned away. But in this case, the Hirsch residence kind of embodies this idea of internalized space that Rudolph creates. If you look at the section, Rudolph does the same thing with his spaces. He's got the fish bowl, which is the central area where the seating is. And I've shown the floor plans here. They are from bottom to top. They are the ground floor, the middle, the first floor, and then the second floor, all opening up to the central space. But the ground floor has this kind of open area, which is meant to be seen. So it's this idea of a fish bowl. And then Rudolph creates this multiple levels in this house. It's kind of like he's extended the Milam house times 3. and essentially has created this level that allows you to look out over it. And that is, as you can see in the photograph, up some stairs, again, without handrails, because everything becomes this kind of like internalized environment, and you climb stairs and then you get up to this level and there's this platform. And again, you've got, then you can look out over the people below, and that becomes the nest. And as Rudolph aged, his idea of nest got higher and higher and higher. And actually, the Modulator building where our headquarters is located for the Paul Rudolph Heritage Foundation is an example of where the nest actually becomes an entire story or even more above. Now, the bedroom is interesting because here again shows you an example. The bedroom is interesting because the windows are on the left and right-hand side of the space. In the space, in this case, for the Hirsch residence, you've got a big giant macrame. We are talking about the 60s. But the idea was that the windows are not important. The view is not important because that is actually out to the street. And who wants to show yourself out to the street? So in this case, the bedroom is actually internalized, and the windows are there just to simply provide some kind of illumination on the walls to allow some kind of interest. It's not to be looked outside onto the street. And so we go to the next slide. Now, as you all know, or most of you probably know, Halston bought this house in 1974. And the first thing he did was he brought Rudolph back to make some changes. And primarily the changes were, and this is 1974, things start to change. They become more dark, they become more moody, they become more full of mirrors. And so the first thing you see on the upper left-hand side, that is the same bedroom, but instead you've got the same windows on left and right, but the center is no longer macrame. Now the center is a mirror. So now you've got a full ceiling to floor mirror over the bed in the bedroom. That is actually Halston's bedroom. On the photograph to the right of that, it's interesting because that is what was originally on the left-hand side where the photographs were. That was a bookcase. But Halston didn't care about reading books. Instead, he had Andy Warhol photographs put up. And that was the first thing that Rudolph did, was to remove the bookcases and put these wonderful photographs of Halston by Andy Warhol up. And that became kind of like, in this case, the house became this kind of like bar where you would kind of have to climb the steps and meet, Halston at this kind of like elevated level. And there were pictures of him behind him. And that was, the whole house became this idea of playful and kind of almost like a bar interior. I've got lots of photographs here where Halston posed as models on various furniture. There were also photographs, and this is rather scary for those of you who have vertigo, of models and people dancing on some of the floating platforms that Rudolph had installed. And this actually made some headlines because people were known to fall off of these. Notably, Divine was at one of these parties and she fell off, and in the middle of a performance, and it started singing on the floor after she fell down. Everyone was drug and fueled and crazy and having a good time. And so we've got the photo, one of the photographs on the right-hand side in the middle, and then a famous photograph. And I'm not sure if this is exactly true. There's so much of what happened here becomes legendary, and you don't know if what you hear is actually true. But the photograph on the lower right is Liza Minnelli having fallen off a Paul Rudolph stair and landing on the floor, and then having her photograph taken by Andy Warhol, trying to look her best like she didn't make a mistake. So, again, this is one of those party places that Rudolph started out something very simple, this idea of a personal space for these two guys who were living together who wanted to avoid being out in public. And this turns into this very public space, a very party space, and everything becomes this kind of like dramatic, can I be seen? Can you see me? Can I look out over you? It's almost like a bar. And that was not the way Rudolph originally intended. And so the next slide. Now, interestingly enough, Rudolph did not always work on architectural projects. In the late 60s and 70s, there was actually a fire in Yale in 1969, which kind of ruined Rudolph's reputation, because people thought that it was set on purpose by people that didn't like his work. And his reputation started to suffer. And he started doing more and more, and this happened actually toward the middle of the 60s, towards the middle of the 70s, more projects that were internalized and private clients' apartments. And he started doing these apartments that did not require a lot of change in architecture, but simply changes to the interiors. And what's interesting is this kind of coincides with Rudolph, where he starts experimenting with plastics and metals. And he's in Yale, he had done these curtains that were out of like a fishnet as a way to moderate the sunlight that was going into Yale. But in this case, in the late 60s, he starts experimenting with metallics. So in this case, he actually strews entire parts of the ceiling and the walls out of these little tiny mirrors and plastic objects that are attached to the fish wire, so that it actually becomes this kind of like shimmer curtain. So his entire spaces become these dramatic backdrops, and he's only experimenting with interior finishes. He's not experimenting with changing architecture. He's not moving doors and walls sometimes. He's not changing too much. In this case, he did add the staircase, but he starts experimenting with plastics, and he starts experimenting with platforms, and it becomes more of an internalized space, like a interior environment. He starts changing like the whole impact of the space by making it feel like it is an entire world unto itself, but yet not changing actual partitions always. In this case, if you look at the lower left, sorry, the staircase starts using plexiglass as a way to, in this case, put candles on the end of each. And he starts playing with light. He starts playing with reflection. He starts playing with mirrors, and he starts playing with translucency, this idea of being seen but not seen, plastics, reflections. And he starts really working with this full palette of materials that become available in the late 60s. So next slide. Now, it's interesting, he does do some houses, like where he gets to design the entire house. In this case, is the Dean residence. And unfortunately, I've got the wrong address. This is actually in Great Neck. And this house is still existing. It's still in perfect condition. I met the owners, and they tell me that it's exactly the way it is right now, which is thankful. In this case, the floor plan, as you see on the lower left, is very Frank Lloyd Wright inspired. But in this case, he's taken his ideas of very simple spaces of fish bowls and caves and nests and tripled it. And now we've got almost like this whale of bones that you climb inside of, and you get to see these different levels, and they get to look back and forth on each other. And so the floor plan on the lower left shows you all these different platforms, and you go up and down stairs, and you go up 3 stairs and down 5 stairs. The elevation, on the other hand, is a little bit more simple. So if you look at the elevation in the middle of the upper part, the elevation is a very simple form. But what he does is he kind of shifts and repeats. He takes a simple form, shifts, repeats, and then the space in between becomes this open area environment. It becomes this kind of like, it's not a box, it's not just a room, it becomes this world that he opens up. And you are allowed to look in and through and down and inside. And so what we see here is on the lower right, the living room. Now everything is illuminated. You've got the floor, you've got the steps, everything floats because he puts lighting under the steps. He's got the greenery that grows down over the balcony. And so that kind of creates this idea that you're almost outside, but you're actually inside. He's got this idea then on the ceiling of having this mirror, so that the mirror fits in between the joists. And so therefore the whole ceiling kind of dissolves. And then he's also, it's interesting because the bedroom on the left-hand side of that image is actually very sedate. And the idea is the bedroom becomes kind of seductive, and the ceiling is copper. And so the whole thing becomes monochromatic, but yet reflective at the same time. The furniture in this space is mirrored. The furniture becomes kind of like this idea of, you know, you kind of see me, I see you. It's kind of like we can watch each other together, but yet the space is a little bit monochromatic. So it's kind of like understood to be a bedroom. And what Rudolph begins to experiment with is the sexuality of spaces, primarily of bedrooms and bathrooms. And so the bathroom, interestingly enough, on the upper right-hand side, it's interesting because the bathroom is actually more active than the bedroom. The bathroom is red. It's got these amazing lights that are Hollywood lights around the where the mirror is for the makeup room. But what's interesting, what I love the most is the bathtub, which you see on the left. The bathtub is actually sunken into the floor. It becomes part of the landscape. The bathtub becomes central to the space. And then behind it is this idea of mirror. And this idea of mirror, there are actually little slivers of mirror. And now actually what we discovered was Rudolph hired architecture students. You know, this is back in the day when architecture students were paid nothing. And architecture students would come out and say, oh, I want to work for Mr. Rudolph. Well, he would say, okay, I'm going to put you to work gluing mirrors onto my client's wall. And so these mirrors are actually little slivers of rectangular mirrors offset. So you get kind of this step and repeat pattern. So the entire wall becomes this dissolved pattern of mirror. So no matter where you are, if you're in the bathtub, if you're taking a look at yourself in the mirror, you see multiple reflections and patterns and parts of you that are reflected amongst back and forth of the space. And this is actually something that's rather fascinating in the bedroom, in the bathroom. Next slide. Now, one of the things that Rudolph does when he doesn't get the opportunity to change an interior environment where he can't change the architecture, let's say, and there was a number of those. In the 70s, Rudolph gets a number of clients who say, I can't touch the architecture, but I want something by Rudolph. And this is one of those cases. The Eldon residence at 1 West 64th Street, unfortunately, we're not sure if it's still there. I kind of doubt it, but you know, we haven't reached out to the client and we don't know if it's still around. Was one of those cases where Rudolph tries to create an environment without touching the architecture. And this has been written about by a number of people. Kissing Architecture is a book that talks about Rudolph and the interiors in this particular project, which is amazing. And it talks about how Rudolph worked with what he could, which was light. He worked with what he could on the interior as far as furniture. And so in this case, and I like to call this, I don't know what y'all think about it. I don't know. I hear some people say it looks like mushrooms. I hear people say it looks like clouds. I just know it's rather crazy. I mean, it deals with a little bit of plexiglass to hold the seating up, but then Rudolph's got this wall-to-wall kind of moonscape out of, wall-to-wall carpeting, shag carpeting, chicken nuggets. There you go. Absolutely. Although I don't know if I like chicken nuggets, but okay, I can't get that out of my head. But you know, the idea of creating an environment where Rudolph created something from scratch without touching the walls. Now, what's interesting is that Rudolph does two things. He's always interested in light because he thinks light is the one thing that he can change without having to change too much architecture. So he's always working with that. He worked with that from the very beginning. He still works with that when he creates companies like Moduliter, which to this day still exist using lighting fixtures that he's created. And then in this case, he does a very early thing with par lamps. So if you look at the upper right-hand side, Rudolph actually drops on very long extension cords these par lamps that basically light the floor. He can't change the architecture. So what does he do? He lights it up in a way that makes it look like it's been changed. So these par lamps create this kind of like linear procession around the outside of the building that light it up, that create this kind of like environment that's really interesting and kind of like different. And then over the fireplace, if you see where it says 810, over the fireplace, that's actually a projection that Rudolph created using a typical slide projector. And what happened was that Rudolph would create slides that would say the time, I think it was in every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes, and the slide would change in the basically round part of the slide projector. I know it's been a long time. I can't remember exactly what it's called. Nobody uses slide projectors anymore, but in the part of the slide projector would turn and the time would change and would be synced with the actual time so that people would know what time it was. And this was Rudolph's understanding of being able to change architecture by projecting things onto it. Again, things about this time period where Rudolph could change things by simply projecting objects or changing the lighting, changing the mood, changing the material. Again, look at this though. Rudolph uses wall-to-wall carpeting. This is a very common thing. The entire environment is monochromatic. very similar, and the mood is created by lighting and by changing objects. So next slide. Now, this is Rudolph's own apartment. So when Rudolph left Yale, he moves to New York City. In 1965, he rents an apartment at 23 Beekman Place in New York City, and he is renting. And so he cannot build anything in the building, but he can change the interiors as much as he wants. So I like to call this Paul Rudolph's, Dr. Seuss period. If you look at his drawings on the upper left-hand side, these are two drawings of the space that is he very formally drafted below it, which was these ideas of having a space where you have a dining room, you have seating around it, and then you have this projecting space towards the glass, which was actually towards the river, which looked out onto Roosevelt Island. And then the bedroom, which was very enclosed and very private. And in the Dr. Seuss drawing up above, the kitchen is very pushed out into the space. The steps come down. Everything is very emotional. Everything is very much, flowing and curvy. Rudolph obviously has to deal with a little bit of reality, and the space becomes more rectilinear, so that if you look at the floor plan, the bed is pushed up against a straight wall. The kitchen is a typical galley kitchen, but Rudolph still gets to play with lighting. And so these are Tong Yi photographs. They were widely published of the house. The upper left-hand side is the house looking out towards the river. Rudolph keeps these platforms elevated. Everything's lit so it floats. And then he's got these lighting strips that he puts in the floor, and that's done on purpose because he wants it to look like a runway. So that, as you see on the right, when the lights are turned off, it kind of glows, and the reflection in the window makes it look like the lighting extends out into infinity over and out beyond the building. So it looks like this runway that kind of swoops you off into space. And then the bedroom, which is very interesting, and Rudolph said in the interview, this was published in House and Garden, Rudolph says, I cannot feel depressed in this space, or something to that extent. He feels like this kind of space is the space where he can kind of huddle and hide in. This becomes a mirrored fantasy of these light fixtures that are suspended in front of these. If you look at that photograph on the left, that's the left wall is mirrored. The ceiling is mirrored. The right wall is mirrored. The bedroom is entirely mirrored. And what Rudolph does is he takes common Christmas tree lights, white, and attaches them to these sanded plexiglass tubes, which he actually had people in his office hand sand all of the plexiglass tubes. And they put them together, and he creates these light curtains that extend up, but because the ceiling's mirrored, it looks twice as high as it really is. So the bedroom becomes this kind of display space where everything is mirrored and becomes like the Milky Way. And Ernst Wagner, who knew Rudolph, who is the founder of the Heritage Foundation that I run, told me that when he was in the space, he felt like he was in the middle of the Milky Way, that kind of light curtain, which later became one of the first lighting fixtures that were produced by the lighting company that Rudolph co-founded with him, Modulator, was known as kind of like the Milky Way light fixture, that the light curtain, which got well publicized in the 1970s. Next slide.
Hey, Kelvin, it's Chris. We already hit our limit. So.
Oh my God. Okay, so I'm going to go really fast. Can I go really fast?
Nay.
Okay.
We have to take some questions, Kelvin.
Oh my God. So really fast. This is
Okay,
what
really
Rudolph
fast.
does.
Conclude.
Rudolph does this. This is crazy. Rudolph takes
Okay.
what he had and turns it into this quadruplex with crazy bathtubs made of clear plexiglass, which I show on the lower right, and sinks that look down to the floor below. He gets this kind of crazy knowledge of this idea of looking down into people and space and things and mirrors, and it becomes really crazy. And so next slide. This is an example of a current house, 1986. He does the same thing. This is the house that's for sale, actually, and wants to buy it. The only known Rudolph wine cellar that I've ever seen, which is on the lower right, in the lower middle. And then the bathroom, again, Rudolph and bathrooms, bathtub is center, but but the mirrors on either side reflect you to infinity. This idea of you're sitting in the bathtub, you're soaking, but you can see multiples of you on either the left and the right-hand side, which are amazing. And then next slide. And then I want to finish with the bathroom for male and female. So little known, Rudolph was hired by, we think, by a well-known company that supplied bathroom fixtures to design what he thought of a male and female bathroom. You can tell me, which one do you think is male and female? Female, lots of canals, lots of this idea of makeup counters and chaise lounges, and he thought everyone wanted to relax. And then the male is the opposite. He's got this center space which has weights, and you're going to do exercising, and you've got this kind of like pull and push up in the center of the space. And it's fascinating because this didn't get published very much, but this is an example of Rudolph being hired to kind of explain the difference between the sexes. And that concludes what I'm going to say.
Thank you, Calvin. And I'm thinking, and now we have, I've been posting in the chat all the links to each of those buildings as you were talking about them. And I'm sorry to interrupt. I wanted to give some time for a couple of questions. I know that Chris Rollins was in the Q&A box. Chris and Liz, if you want to go ahead and turn on, or at least Chris, I wanted to answer one of these questions myself. This comes from Kevin, who says, why is it that there's been a propensity in Hollywood films over the decades for the evil villain to live in a modern or modernist style lair? And I've done a lot of research about that. And actually, Raymond Neutra was commenting to the panelist that a lot of these buildings, I see you got your drink, Kelvin. A lot of these buildings were created for families. So John Lautner created the Sheets Goldstein House for families. The Cave Study House 21 by Pierre Koenig was created for a family, and they actually raised their little children at that place. And if you've been there like I have, you will fall off the edge of that thing. I think partly it's how these turned into villains' lairs is I traced it back to Alfred Hitchcock. He's the first one who combined that sort of handsome villain as a character, and they needed to find a new way to house that handsome villain. The vampire castle wasn't going to do it anymore. So they created that, Robert Boyle, his production designer, created the house, famous house in North by Northwest, which was just a set and a matte painting, but it's supposed to be behind Mount Rushmore. Hey, there's Chris. And so I've traced that as one of the first times that modernism was shown in the films as a villain's lair. There's one occurs before that in the 1930s in The Black Cat. But after that, it was so popular that Hitchcock started it, and it just took off. And I think people think of villains as being very disciplined. They see modernism as very disciplined. And I think that combination is why we see that become sort of an archetype. Were you going to say something, Calvin?
No, I was just going to say that I think you're absolutely right. I think that my favorite is always the villains quietly. And I think that the villains always have the best plan. I mean, nobody goes to see a movie to see what the good guys are doing. They want to see what the villains are doing. So it makes sense.
And it's kind of an unachievable idea. Some of these houses you never get in. They're very private. You don't know who lives in there. It must be something crazy going on in there. It's like Sheets Goldstein. All you ever see is the front of the driveway. You never see the house. Anyways, so do you want to take a question, John? I'm trying to read too many things at one time.
Yeah, there were a number of questions, and maybe I'll try to condense them. But I think there was a lot of questions about the styles that all of you are presenting. A lot of curvature, but then the angular geometry is also part of this. Is there a style that you associate with what you've been sort of describing in your histories that kind of I would call the curviness, that organicist kind of style of architecture, but then you've got the earlier sort of era of modernism, which is very boxy and angular and geometric. So how do those two fit together?
Who goes? I think for Rudolph, go ahead, Chris. I mean, I think
I think I will. I mean, there's a lot there, but I think there's sort of for lack of a better term, there's an organic, tradition in modern architecture, which you see, encapsulated by people like, Bruce Goff and so forth, and into some of Rudolph's late, 70s work. But there's also, if you look at a lot of, let's say, Gifford's work, it's not necessarily, curvilinear all the time, although sometimes it certainly is. But even when it isn't, I think that a kind of sexuality in space can be determined by how it presents itself to the street. And so there's a number of Gifford houses that are literally these sort of these stages that sort of work their way down, to a public space. And they're these kind of prosceniums for people to kind of act out a summer fantasy. And so a sexuality and a sexualized space can be really any number of forms. It's really how they're arranged and how they are seen.
And to your point, Christopher, I was fascinated by what you said, because in your presentation, your work that you showed was fascinating in the sense that that's very Rudolphian. I mean, the houses were very simple, very interesting, and very much like Rudolph in the very early days. And Rudolph kind of went away from that. He actually started playing with plastics, playing with curved forms, and playing with this kind of different ideas, whereas what you showed was very much the opposite, but yet they were contemporary.
Well, and actually, if I didn't have good enough, I wanted to keep the book sort of disciplined and focused, but Gifford also did a number of apartments. And in the apartment work, it was a very he took some similar tacks to Rudolph. I mean, he was very much, spying through the glass at Rudolph in every project he did.
I didn't get a chance to talk about the glass bottom bathtub, but I mean, like, Rudolph is famous for these ideas of like seeing and not being seen. And I just love that you were talking about that in Fire Island, because having been to Fire Island, not in those houses, I wish I could get in those houses, but in the houses I did get into, they're amazing in the sense that, yes, it's all about being on display. And I think that's the whole gist of what we're talking about, is the 60s takes you from being the 50s, which is don't see me, and turns it into see me. And Rudolph was all about see me, but see me from the back, don't see me from the front. And I don't know if in your case, Christopher, the Fire Island is not really the case per se, because everyone knew each other, but Rudolph was about the public doesn't get to see what actually happens behind the front facade.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that relates to one of the questions we got, which was the elimination of walls and use of open plans an explicit attempt to promote freedom from past sexual norms, or just a response? I mean, I think it was partly both. And a lot of modern people that I know, including myself, are introvert extroverts. And I think modernism captures that perfectly. So you can be very private on the outside. And once you get in, past that release point, you're into this very open, you're into this very open atmosphere, but not that many people are allowed in the front door. It's very private. And I think that did permit people to have some sexual freedom. Like you talked about, Chris, I was so impressed when I saw your talk a few years ago, and I have a copy of your book, and I think maybe that's part of it. I wanted to ask one more question too, for you, Kelvin. What's your favorite book on Rudolph that shows off his weirdest and craziest stuff?
That's hard. Everyone always asks me what's my favorite Rudolph, and I am such a big Rudolph fan. I love all of it. I have to, though, admit my favorite is probably his later work in the 70s, as you can tell. I think 23 Beekman Place was amazing just because he set up these views. You go up these stairs or go over a walkway that's made of plexiglass, and the idea is looking down and being afraid. He wants you to fear and be aware of where you are. That is interesting to me, but also the idea of some of his work where he's dealing with families, such as his work. He did this wonderful house in Detroit, outside of Detroit in Grosse Pointe. And it's just a series of cubes, but these ideas of being in a controlled environment, but looking out over these various parts of the other part of the house. This idea of seeing, but not being seen yourself. I know there's been a lot of books written about this, but I think Rudolph actually embodied that. And so, yeah, I think I can't tell you what's my favorite. I don't know. Good question.
There's so many. The people are posting in the chat about plexiglass walkway. I know that Neutra used it was a glass walkway at the Cyclorama, which was eventually demolished, and he used it as this way of reaching from one point to another over this kind of position of transparency, so that you could feel that you were floating from the seriousness of the painting into the visitor experience on the battlefield. I need to wrap it up because it's kind of late here on the East Coast, as you know. So if I wanted to thank everybody for all of your time and expertise. I think everyone's really, hey, there's George. And thank you, George, for sponsoring, and Liz and Docomomo US for partnering with us. And George, you have empty martini glass, thanks to US Modernist Radio for everything you've done. We have another program coming up on Tuesday. John and I just gone crazy for this modernist thing, right, John? We just can't stop.
Absolutely. And if any of you are interested in Paul Revere Williams, you will get to see him next Tuesday at 12 noon. Is that right?
George, somebody's asked about your background. Yes, 12 noon next Tuesday, and that one is free. And we hope that everybody can join us. And we'll see you again. We'll see you again on Tuesday, everyone. So thank you for joining us. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Oh, I forgot. John put a link in the chat for our survey, right?
Well, yeah, I was also going to mention, because we have such a national audience and international now. 12 noon is in Pacific time, everybody. So if you want to sign up for that program, it's always in Pacific time. Just because we're in California, we have to stick to that time. But
it helps. That's our standard.
Yeah.
Look us up at Paul Rudolph Heritage Foundation, please. If anyone wants to know more about Paul Rudolph, we're at the Paul Rudolph Heritage Foundation.
Oh, and still somebody wants to know what your background is, George. Before we sign off, we got to know. You're on mute, George. George, you're still muted.
Has to unmute.
I can't read the lips yet.
Okay, now there he is.
14 years ago, I was minding my own business, doing a late night Google search, and accidentally I have become this archivist with this wild website now, kind of out of control, documenting everything. So my wife refers to this whole thing as a 14-year extended seizure.
What is your background? What is the background picture?
I was a management consultant for 30 years.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. We meant your background picture, George.
Oh.
In your Zoom.
Okay. Well, you got to tell me. So this is a tube inside the atomium.
Oh, okay. All right.
Belgium, set up for the 1958 World's Fair.
Wonderful. You got me laughing, George. Thank you so much. Anyways, we will see all of you again soon. So thanks for joining us. All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys.